is there a Chinese-led recovery for global capital?
What global capitalism is lacking is demand. If we had that kind of political revolution in America and in Europe, while China is doing what it is doing, I think that would be brilliant for humanity. Here in Europe, the little revolution we staged in 2015 was snuffed out by the Troika.
Are we seeing parallels of the 1920s and 30s in Europe?
Whenever you have, however, a crash that leads to a deflationary period, like we had in both 1929 and 2008, the fascists, the racists, they rise up, especially when the left is completely disorganized and cannot make a sustainable campaign happen, cannot build up a sustainable campaign with a program that can excite people's imagination and thinking.
So why is European left so divided and weak?
Can you edit it? I said, okay, what do you want to edit for my series? She said, well, you've got several books published. Can you just take them out? I said, why? She says, well, people, I mean, your published work is excellent and, they would love it, your CV and so on. But when they see that you're publishing books, they think that you don't have enough focus on
academics,
on research papers. What?
Hello and welcome. Today we have a very special guest with us, Yanis Varoufakis. Yanis is an economist, professor, and left-wing Greek politician. Yanis has taught at several universities in Britain, Australia, Greece, and the United States. He became the finance minister of Greece in 2015 when the coalition of radical left Progressive Alliance came to power. In March 2018, he founded Mira 25, the electoral wing of DIM 25 in Greece. In the 2019 legislative election, Mira 25 was the sixth most voted party, amassing 9 parliamentary seats, with Yanis himself returning to the Hellenic Parliament. He is currently serving as a member of parliament in Greece. Yanis, welcome to India and Global Left.
I'm very glad to be with you, India and Global Left.
Yep, thanks. So I always feel that starting on a lighter note is a win-win situation for all. So before we dip into questions of economics and politics, would you mind telling us a little bit on your childhood? Who were your parents and who were you during high school? I see a lot of influence of classical European literature in your writings. So who were you during high school?
Well, I mean, I come from a middle-class Greek background. My father was a chemical engineer. He spent quite a few years in a prison camp for left-wingers when he was a student. My mother came from a more conservative background, but they both drifted towards, socialist politics. Then we had the fascist dictatorship between 1967 and 1974. My father was imprisoned again. My uncle, my mother's brother, was convicted to a death sentence for his involvement in opposing the dictatorship. So I grew up in a very political family and environment, politicized by stealth from a very young age. In our house, we had some very simple rules. It was a very liberal establishment, but my mother in particular was very keen that I should read some basic literature before I am 15. So I had to go through Dostoevsky and Shakespeare and the Greek classics and so on. and anything else went. So, played a lot of football and volleyball, but, it was very liberal, except that I had to read several books, which were essential. My father, on the other hand, was schooling me to the importance of science and engineering in a very, very cute and attractive way, I have to say. So, I had a very privileged upbringing, even though for many people, the idea that I was in a family where, the secret police would spy on us, my father would suddenly disappear in the middle of the night, sounded like a nightmare. For me, these were exciting, because in quite a good childhood. No complaints.
Interesting. I see the influence of science fiction on you as well.
Of course.
Right. So, let's jump into politics and economics. Let's begin with Europe. In your influential work, Europe After Minotaur, you have given us a hypothesis based on crippling surplus recycling mechanisms that explains the long economic crisis the world is going through, worsening particularly after the global financial crash in 2008. Let's take Europe. It's impossible to understand the economic crisis within the Eurozone without understanding its division between what you call the surplus states, led by Germany, Netherlands, Finland, and Austria, and the deficit states of Greece, Portugal, Ireland, Italy, and Spain. Give us a historical background on what happened through the 90s with the fall of the Soviet Union and the Berlin Wall, the creation of a unified monetary system without a mechanism of surplus recycling through common deficit finding and accessible investments, as you suggested.
Well, every economy, whether it's the planet as a whole, or India, or Greece, or Germany, or Europe, it will always have segments that are in surplus and segments that are in deficit. The cities usually are in surplus, and the rural areas are usually in deficit, not in agricultural deficit, but overall. So if you go to Britain, for instance, you'll find that today you have the south, which is richer and has a surplus, and the north, which has a deficit. Germany, East, West Germany, same story. North, South Italy, in the United States, California versus Arizona, or wherever you see. It's quite completely natural. You are not going to have balanced growth and balanced trade anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway. So the question is, when you've got, let's say, take the American example, you've got California and Arizona. California will always be in surplus vis-a-vis Arizona. So the question is, if one of the two sub-economies has a permanent surplus, how does the deficit economy finance its deficit? Something has to give. Either it's going to go bankrupt, and then it will not import anything from the surplus part. Arizona will stop importing from California because it will be bankrupt.
Mm-hmm.
Or there has to be a way of recycling Californian surpluses into Arizona, so that the surpluses of California somehow find themselves their way into Arizona to keep this recycling loop going. So in federal systems, in unitary economies, like in India, like in the United States, like Germany, the way it used to be, it was a state that played that role of recycling the surpluses. So in the United States, we know how it happens, mostly. Mm-hmm. It's things. Firstly, Social Security, right? So, food stamp systems. So you have taxes paid in California being recycled in Arizona in the form of food stamps, in the form of Social Security, and primarily, of course, the military-industrial complex. So when Boeing gets a contract to build a new fighter jet, Congress says to them, "Okay, sure, but you're going to build the wings of the plane in Missouri. You're going to build the engines in Arizona, so in the deficit states, mm-hmm. so that surpluses from the surplus states go to the deficit states to keep the thing going." What happens at the planetary level? These imbalances, macroeconomic imbalances, we call them, can lead to gigantic crashes, like in the 1920s, 1929, like in 2008. For instance, after the Second World War, the United States government, under the New Dealers who were in power after 1936 and throughout the war, during the war economy, then immediately after 1945, they decided that they will have to create a surplus society, a balanced surplus society mechanism. It's called the Bretton Woods system. The whole point of the Bretton Woods system was to take surpluses from the United States, which was a surplus economy, and distribute it to Japan and to Europe in order to maintain the dominance of the United States. It wasn't philanthropy, it was just common sense. Now that lasted beautifully until the late 1960s, then America lost the surpluses, so it couldn't recycle surpluses it didn't have. And in the meantime, Europe had developed its union, the European Economic Community, right, which was effectively a cartel of big business.
Mm-hmm.
They tried to create, like OPEC has one cartel for oil, they tried to create a European Union out of a cartel of coal, steel, the car industry, the electronics industry, and then later farming, the common agricultural policy. And it was all working because the Americans under Bretton Woods had designed that global recycling mechanism, part of which was fixed exchange rates. Effectively, we all had the same currency, the dollar. We didn't have dollars in the pockets here in Greece, we had drachmas. But when I grew up, it was 30 drachmas to a dollar, day in, day out for years. Right. So there was no exchange rate fluctuation. It was like having, if you had 30 drachmas in your pocket, you had a dollar. So the cartel, like OPEC needs one currency in which to trade, and that's the dollar for oil. The European cartel, which is otherwise known as the European Union or the European Economic Community back then, had that fixed exchange rate regime. But when the Bretton Woods system collapsed in 1971, the Europeans were struggling to recreate it on their own, and they couldn't, because they did not have either the architectural capacities of the United States or the political unity and the political organization. There was no such thing as a European federal government, right? So they struggled, created the European exchange rate mechanism, the European monetary system. All that failed, and then they decided, okay, stuff this, will have one currency, the euro. But they didn't create the surplus recycling mechanism, which was essential in order to support it. The result is the euro crisis and the catastrophe of the euro was created in 1992, in the 1990s. By the time it came together in the late 1990s, the Americans were stabilizing the world again with a very imbalanced, very interesting, just absolutely crazy surplus recycling mechanism. Effectively, Wall Street was absorbing the 70% of the net profits from all over the world, from Asia, from Europe, from Japan, later from China, okay, to finance huge deficits, trade deficits of the United States that act as a vacuum cleaner, sucking to America the net exports of everybody, your country, in India, in China, Germany, Japan, and so on. But that thing collapsed in 2008 because of the crisis of Wall Street, because they overdid it. They just created too much private money. And then since then, the capitalism has been in deep trouble. And central banks have tried to stabilize and refloat finance. They succeeded in doing this. But, the working people of the world were condemned to permanent universal austerity. That meant very low investment. And then we had the lockdown, the pandemic, where you had the governments having to print more money, the central banks, while at the same time constraining supply, lockdown. And that created inflation. And now that genie is out of the bag. So, one crisis is leading to the next. And global capitalism is in dire straits. I have a theory, this is my next book, a theory that I've already articulated. I think that capitalism has died, and it has given rise to something far, far worse, which I call techno-feudalism. Okay. There you are. All my thinking in one stream of consciousness.
Yeah, I listened to some of your early thoughts about techno-feudalism, but just to wrap up this segment, I had one more question. So, in the same book, you have argued that this sort of re recycling of surplus mechanism that existed, um, starting with 70s and then, going over the cliff in 2008, that was disturbed, and increasing financialization led to private profiteering, which led to crash. And you seem to suggest that a European recovery is not on the side because the German bank, what you call the bankruptocracy, is refusing to allow a recycling within the Eurozone. But also a US-based recovery is not on site. You have shown some data that the consumption level to consume the global surplus from China, Germany, Japan has not bounced back in the United States up to the pre-2008 level. My question is, and which you haven't gone into too much of detail, is about a China-led possible recovery for the global capital. You have said that the China has failed to restructure itself uh, in terms of absorbing through domestic consumption some of its surpluses that is produced for the global economy, and it led to housing bubble. So, is there a Chinese-led recovery for global capital?
No, there can be. And that's not a criticism of China. This is a very simple idea that I have, that a very simple hypothesis that I table. What global capitalism is lacking is demand. Demand. The reason why for 13 years investment has been so low in Europe, in the United States, not in China or in India, but in Europe and the United States, because the level of demand by the local populations is very low. So businesses do not invest. So all the money that the central banks have been printing to refloat the economy, business people take this money and they look around, they see a lack of demand. So why invest? Why take the risk? They take the money to the stock exchange and buy back their own shares. Their shares goes up, used to go up, and they made money out of that. But that left aggregate demand and investment very low. Mm-hmm. China cannot plug the gap. I mean, the Chinese economy played a huge role in 2008 to prevent capitalism from collapsing.
That's right.
Because what they did was they cranked up their own investment massively. So they started absorbing.
Through infrastructure, roads, buildings.
Absolutely, through infrastructure. And also because of the need for intermediate and final capital goods from Germany and countries like Germany, they managed to replace all the lost demand for the German factories, all the demand that the German factories no longer had from places like Greece, Italy, and so on, because we had collapsed. They were selling to China. So China played a very stabilizing role. But as long as the Chinese economy is a net exporter, it cannot provide the missing demand to the capitalist economies of the West. It is only if it goes into deficit. I mean, the reason why the United States played the role of the surplus recycler was because of the great deficit. But they could afford it because they had the dollar and Wall Street. And that caused a tsunami of money to go into the United States and finance the deficits. The Chinese are not going to do that. They cannot do it, and they shouldn't do it. It's not their job to rebalance the United States and Europe. But I have to say that over the last couple of years, they have been managing a pretty good period of transition. So the real estate bubble, they are deflating it. You can see what's happening with various companies like Evergrande and so on. They are allowing them to go steadily bankrupt, but in a controlled kind of bankruptcy. So that, as President Xi said, and that was quite impressive when he said that in order to increase the living standards and the buying power of the average family in China, we have to reduce aggregate investment from 48 to 30%. Now, that takes a degree of sophistication to be able to say this as a president of the country, but you need to reduce the investment rate from very high and sustainable levels of almost 50% to 30%. And they're doing that. But that is going to rebalance China. It's not going to rebalance the global economy.
Right. I mean, as you spoke, I was just wondering, like, what if a left, there is a resurgence of the left in the United States, which leads to, a regulated capitalist economy that pulls back money to the working class to lift demand so as to consume global surpluses. I mean, this is very, very
Well,
speculative.
no, look, if we had that kind of political revolution in America and in Europe, while China is doing what it is doing, I think that would be brilliant for humanity. But we don't. We had a political revolution with Bernie Sanders in 2016, which stalled, unfortunately. It was stopped in its tracks by the Democratic Party that stole the primary election from Bernie. That's my view. He would have beaten Trump. He was the only Democrat who could have beaten Trump in 2016, not Hillary. Here in Europe, the little revolution we staged in 2015 was snuffed out by the Troika. And this has been to the detriment of both Europe and the United States, and of course, of humanity as a whole, because, without the rebalancing that we are discussing now, you and I, there can be no serious investment in the green transition that humanity needs to avoid the climate catastrophe that's coming. So there you are. The two are related.
This is a very good entry point to come to a little bit of discussion on politics. As we speak, I was going through the newspaper. We are getting reports of the Meloni-led right-wing coalition almost coming to power in Italy. And this is days after the right-wing coalition came to power in Sweden. There is a ruling nationalist party in Poland, one in Britain, in Spain, in Hungary. In Spain, the far-right Vox party is the third largest, if I'm not wrong, party in Spain. Le Pen's national rally came very, very close to power, and AfD has become the largest opposition in German Bundestag. When I read news from Europe, I see dangerous rhetorics of anti-immigration, anti-European Union, pro-policing, just as in the case of Sweden, pro-NATO militarism, and fossil fuel independence. These have become sort of rhetorics of electoral rhetorics in Europe. And it strikes me that Europe of the 1920s had some of these features: inflation, high unemployment. The Republican states had no answer to how to deal with it, and the divisive left was defeated by far-right fascist parties, riding on waves of militarism, nationalism, and racism. Are we seeing parallels of the 1920s and 30s in Europe?
Yes, but as Marx said, history repeats itself as farce. Doesn't just happen as it happened the first time around. So look, the 1920s was very similar to the 2000s. It was a period of absolute exuberance on part of financial capital. They went crazy. That led to 1929, the crash. In our case, 2008. And after that, the establishment did whatever it took in order to stay in power. The difference between 2008 and 1929 was that in 2008, they were smarter than they were in 1929. In 2008, they saved the banks, then the bankers, unlike in 1929. And they were prepared to let the central banks print as much money as was necessary in order to prevent the kind of collapse that we had in 1929, 1930, 1931.
And we had an Obama instead of New Deal.
We had an Obama instead of a New Deal. So in fact, he saved the bankers, not the people. Similar in Europe. Whenever you have, however, a crash that leads to a deflationary period, like we had in both 1929 and 2008, the fascists, the racists, they rise up, especially when the left is completely disorganized and cannot make a sustainable campaign happen, cannot build up a sustainable campaign with a program that can excite people's imagination and thinking. We tried here in Greece, where, as I said, we were snuffed out from within the left. So the left is largely responsible for the rise of the fascists because of our failure. Okay. Having said that, there is a profound difference between now and the fascists of the mid-war period. The difference now is that in the post-1929 period, the fascists and the Nazis took power for themselves and controlled government. Now they don't.
Now the business class is stronger.
Now that, yeah, and they don't need to. You see, now the business class is stronger because the central bank is behind them. But because of the fact that this central bank money doesn't trickle down to the people, there is enough outrage out there so that the Nazis and the fascists can take advantage of that and win influence. But if you look at Greece and Italy, these are two good examples, and they generalize to other cases, but yeah, for the purposes of brevity, allow me to stick to Greece and Germany. Here in Greece, initially after the collapse of 2010, with the rise of a Nazi party, a purely Nazi party, nothing neo-Nazi about Nazi, the Golden Dawn people. They had swastikas, they had Hitler on their walls. You know, it was a Nazi party. They became the third largest party in the Greek parliament. Okay, we defeated them. We defeated them on the streets. But then what happened was, by 2019, when the right got back into power, after the mistakes of the left, the fascists influenced the right-wing conservatives. So they managed to get, even though they didn't win for themselves, government, their policies now, the pushbacks in the Aegean Sea, the fact that the Greek Coast Guard is murdering people, you know, pushing them back into the waves so that they drown. I know that these are very pointed words that I'm using, but they're accurate. And this is done with the consent of a large percentage of the Greek population. You know, this is Nazi policies being implemented by a center-right government. And if you look at some of the people in that government, I mean, one of them, for instance, was advocating some years ago that we need to kill migrants on the borders to stop them from coming. I mean, you can't get more Nazi than that. If you look at Italy, because I mentioned Italy as well, Meloni won yesterday. She comes from the fascist tradition, but she's effectively tolerated by the system because she is doing something similar to the Greek situation. She has a neo-fascist narrative, but she has made her peace with the establishment in Brussels, in Berlin, in Washington, in two important ways. Firstly, she's completely adopted the NATO line that we have to fight until the last Ukrainian is dead or the last Russian is dead. So, you know, war forever. Full support for NATO, which is not something that other fascists have done around Europe. Other fascists have sided with Putin, who is also a fascistoid. So Meloni has completely gone on, thrown her lot in with NATO. And the second major policy change, no longer criticizes the euro, the European Central Bank. She accepted the policies that are being written in Brussels, the austerity policies. Okay, so essentially, she has been co-opted by the establishment. in the same way that the Greek fascists have been co-opted by the Greek establishment. So unlike the 1920s and 30s, the fascists are not winning government for themselves. They're not taking over the system.
So it's like economic
They are being
centrism and culture.
They're being absorbed by the center. The radical center
Right.
and the fascists are now one.
So it's a combination of economic centrism and cultural far right.
Yeah. So they will be nasty to migrants. If you are brown-skinned, right, in Italy, you're going to have serious trouble now with this government. But this government is not going to confront either Brussels on economic matters or Washington on foreign policy.
Right. This brings us to very quick last two questions. Talking about the suicidal left. The European left is clearly on the defensive. I mean, the giant Communist Party of once, it broke down, I think, with the Soviet Union. And the French Communist Party, which is very, very crucial since the 60s, from the 70s, it started losing to the other socialists, but in the 2000s, it has lost a lot of ground. The Labour Party has been completely taken over by the Blairites. From Germany today, we don't hear of any revolutionary radical politics. And the hopes of Podemos and Syriza in Spain and Greece seems to be completely dashed now. So why is European left so divided and weak? And tell our viewers a little bit about the radical alternatives in Europe that are going in on parallel, including, if you wish, the DiEM25.
The short answer to your crucial question is that we claim to be internationalists, but we don't act as internationalists. Our movement, DiEM25, that you kindly refer to, which we set up in 2016, trying to bring the European left together around one program. The whole point of DiEM25 was to say to our comrades in Germany, in Portugal, in Italy, in Britain, and so on, say, listen, guys, we're supposed to be internationalists, right? Remember? Workers of the world unite? Well, the only true internationalists are the bankers. They operate. If you go to Davos, I haven't been, but I imagine that if you go to Davos, where the bankers are sitting there, I've seen the bankers elsewhere, not in Davos, but in London, in Geneva, and so on. When you see them in one room, they are the epitome of solidarity. Doesn't matter whether they are Nigerian, Swiss, German, American, British. They are around. They are like a family. They love each other. They may hate each other, but they behave as if they love each other, right? Pure international solidarity. No racism, no nationalism, no, I'll do things differently as a banker in Britain to what you do it in Sweden. No, they act as one. As one. So the DiEM25, we formed a movement to say to our friends in Die Linke, in Germany, in Podemos, in the French Communist Party, Mélenchon, the Labour Party, say, listen, folks, we need one program. They have one program. The bankers and the establishment have one program. It's privatization. It is printing money for the financiers. It is, Fortress Europe, building a huge wall around Europe against the migrants. They have one program and they follow it to the letter everywhere. Now, isn't it time that we had one program? That if people say to us, okay, so you don't like how Europe is being run. You don't like what the European Central Bank is doing. You don't like the way money is invested. You don't like, the tax system. You don't like this, that, and the other. What would you like instead? Would it not be nice if we had one answer in Germany, in France, in Greece, and we all fought for that one? And we said to them back in 2016, there is a European election coming up in 2019. Why don't we run across Europe with one program? That's the first thing. A lot of them said, yeah, all right, let's do it. From Die Linke, from Podemos, and so on. We had a lot of people who came. And we created what we call the Green New Deal for Europe, DiEM25's Green New Deal for Europe, which was a very good document, I think. It was quite impressive. I was impressed by it. And I think that anybody would be impressed by it. And it was solid. And it was, an answer to what an anti-neoliberal, anti-oligarchic program for Europe would be.
This is like the European cognate of the Ocasio-Cortez-led Green New Deal in the United States.
Yeah, but even you see the Green New Deal in the United States was very flimsy. I mean, if you read it, just a bit of, a bit of tax here, a bit of tax there. No, our Green New Deal for Europe was very substantial. Talked about, basic income, talked about how to fund 500 billion euros or dollars worth of green investments every year using the European Investment Bank, a carbon tax, the whole thing. It was very, very substantial document. Right? And then all our partners with whom we created that together, every single one of them refused to run in the European Parliament elections with it. You know why? Divisions. So in Die Linke, there were the people who were saying within Die Linke, oh, no, we want to disband the European Union. We don't need a European policy. And they are the ones who liked our Green New Deal for Europe. But because they fell out with one another, they couldn't agree. So even the people that agreed with us ended up running in the European Parliament election, not with this program. Others had a policy like Podemos. Podemos had a policy on not having a policy about European policy. So they simply refused. They talked only about Spanish matters.
Right.
So they were refusing to act as internationalists. So the result, of course, was that, when Podemos was at 25% of the vote, which was a very good percentage, right? To make the break to go from 25 to 35, which is what you need to do in order to form government, you've got to answer the question, okay, so what will you do in Brussels? If your finance minister or your prime minister goes to Brussels, what are you going to propose regarding the ECB? If you have nothing, no answer, you don't break that ceiling of 25% and then start going down. So I think internationalism, what we need is a common program, and actually we're good to have it for the world, a global Green New Deal, or call it whatever you want, progressive program, socialist program, call it whatever you want. We need a plan. They have a plan. And the fascists have a plan. Just
absolutely
kill the foreigner, just drown the migrant. That's their plan.
Absolutely. So I would just relieve you with this very light final question. I actually enjoyed reading your book, Talking to My Daughter About the Economy. I think that you succeeded in doing what you intended, like to free economics from the monopoly of economists. I assume the neoclassical economists who have alienated the public not just through fundamentalist neoclassical economics that is bad in sort of explaining realities, but also through models and equations that look scary. You instead use stories from classical myths, lessons from popular science fictions, parallels from history to explain otherwise complicated mechanisms of debt, money, factors of productions, etc. I mean, I recommend everyone to read this book. I was wondering, how does the academic economists respond to books like yours, written in a language intelligible to all?
They don't. They just don't. This is the tragedy of academic economics. Look, they may like it or not like it, but it's not part of their problematique, part of their milieu, part of their thinking. Because this is what has happened to academic economics, you see. It started in Britain sometime in the 1980s, UK universities. I'll give you an example, all right? At some point, I was approached by a friend, a colleague from a university in London, one of the colleges of the University of London. That's a long time ago. This is, 20 years ago. I was approached, would I like a job there? And I was thinking about it at the time. I mean, I didn't object it. I wasn't very. He said, yeah, possibly. He said, okay, send me a CV so I can circulate amongst my colleagues, right? And I sent her, it was a she who was head of department, my CV, and she called me back to say, can you edit it? I said, okay, what do you want to edit for my CV? She said, well, you've got several books published. Can you just take them out? I said, Why? He says, well, people, I mean, your published work is excellent and, they would love it, your CV and so on. But when they see that you're publishing books, they think that you don't have enough focus on
academics.
on research papers. What? So that goes to show, what I mean, that they cannot allow themselves to engage with books which do not collect brownie points in the system within which academic economics grades the research output. So, great economists used to write books, like John Maynard Keynes, wrote the general theory. And we all think of Keynes in terms of the general theory.
Right.
At some point, we stopped writing books and we had to write papers that would have to be published in particular journals. And those journals accepted papers that were written in a language that no one understood, right? So when I write a book like talking to my daughter about the economy, academic economists don't want to hear this. This is, it's outside their terms of reference. That's, this is the tragedy we have. So this is why academic economists are completely irrelevant, because they try to find the truth about capitalism in mathematical models where there can be no capitalism, right? There can be no capitalism in those models because they assume that, that the labor market is like any other market. Well, it's not.
Right.
That the market for money is like any other market. It's not. And this is, and why it's not cannot be understood mathematically. So they get bogged down in a language which is irrelevant to really existing capitalism, in the same way that Marxist economists in the Soviet Union, were irrelevant because their economics had nothing to do with the Soviet Union. So there you are.
Right. This reminds me of what you've used in your book, but I have read it elsewhere too, in many cases, that economics is too important to be left to economists.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Unlike science, unlike, engineering, if you want to build a bridge, you have to go to an engineer, otherwise the bridge is going to collapse and you'll kill people. With economics, there's no such thing as an expert economics engineer. This is why we need democracy, because these are the political decisions. The big economic questions are political.
Absolutely. All right. On this note, that big economic questions are always political, we sign off. And thank you so much for joining us. This was a big pleasure.
Pleasure was mine. Thank you.